So, real talk, this might be one of my favorite crossovers ever. And I just read this only like a few days ago, and it's still fresh in my mind. I'm like, oh yeah, this is still probably might be one of the best crossovers I've ever read. And that of course is Batman the Shadow. Now I got this as a Christmas present for my brother, and I was just kind of like, hey, can you get me this comic? And he was like, okay, and I got it, yay. Oh my god, I'm glad that he did, because Batman the Shadow, like I said, is probably one of the best best crossover comics I've ever read. Jesus Christ, it's so good. Anyway, so this comic came out this year in April. It started in April and is actually now doing its it now has its sequel, which I think is midway through, which I'm definitely going to read. Now, this comic actually comes from Scott Snyder and Steve Orlando, but the original script is done by Steve Orlando, who also is currently doing the sequel, The Shadow Batman. And, and this is someone who's not, and from what I understand, Steve Orlando did a vast majority of the writing, but Scott Snyder didn't, even though his name's on it. I think from word on the street is he did a majority of, like, the plotting and he didn't do a lot of co-writing. I think he just helped with plot details, but that's the word on the street. I don't know if that's the official thing. And this was a majority of Steve Orlando's work. So, yeah. Now, The Shadow Batman is an interesting crossover because, incidentally, even long before New 52 and before Crisis on Infinite Earths, what happened was that, there was there were two crossovers where DC had the Shadow in DC Universe and teaming up with Batman. So this is nothing new. This is nothing new, even though the Shadow's now under Dynamite Comics. And this is, I think, because for a while, I thought it was DC and Dynamite's first crossover together, but then I remembered, oh yeah, Kevin Smith wrote that Green Hornet Batman 66 crossover. That's right, I totally forgot about it. That was their first crossover together. And I think DC and Dynamite should work, and they're, of course, doing the sequel, and yeah. So here's hoping we get, like, I don't know, Constantine and Army of Darkness. Just saying, that would be awesome. So let's dig into this crossover, shall we? Now, the story is that Batman is on the hunt for Lamont Cranston, who has murdered Lamont Cranston. Let me explain. In Arkham Asylum, there was a man named Lamont Cranston who was actually a staff worker who actually treated the Arkham Asylum inmates with respect and always gave them what they wanted. Like, there's a scene where he's feeding the inmates and he's giving them their favorite food. Like, for Maxie Zeus, he actually pulled up an ancient Greek dish to make for Maxie to eat. He got a ballpark frank for Two-Face. He also got this Swedish dish, which is ice cold shark. There's a whole thing to it. But yeah, he got that for him, and a deep fried tarantula for Ivy, which I was like, okay, Ivy eats spiders. Alright. But then he is killed, and then when Batman investigates the murder, he finds out that it was Lamont Cranston, the Shadow. But he's been dead for 50 years. So he makes the connection that, Lamont Cranston is, I don't know how he's alive. He's been dead for over 50 years. I need to go find him. So, yeah, they're basically saying that all the stuff that happened with Cranston in the, with the Shadow, all happened in the 50s. It's a pulp era story. So, yeah. And they do not shy away that the Shadow is not a good person. In this comic, he's not like, oh, I was a symbol for all that. I was trained, I wanted, the Shadow was a big inspiration. No, in here, Batman's like, dude, Cranston kills people! Like, no doubt about it. Also, it's kind of funny because they leave it up to the whole thing of, the Shadow trains Batman, and one of the identities he takes is Henry Ducard, which is kind of funny because, if you've seen Batman Begins, then you know how that's hilarious. But anyway, I digress. In here, this is what I really like about the comic, and how Snyder and Orlando handle even though they're similar, they're still vastly different characters of Batman and Shadow. The Shadow is pretty much everything Batman could be. He is pretty much Lamont Cranston is everything Bruce Wayne could be as Batman, where he has forsaken his humanity, his friends around him. He even like Margot, his friend, like his longtime love Margot Lane, is he's told everyone to call him Master and not the Shadow or Lamont Cranston or Kent Allard. He's told them to call him Master and all that. And he almost has like this cult following around him. And Batman could you can see that Batman could easily become the Shadow. And, he is just a stone's throw away from being that character. And there's an interesting back and forth between them. Several back and forths between them where, Batman easily knows he could just have a bad day and become the Shadow. So the whole story is, we find out more that there is this villain called the Stag, who's teamed up with the Joker to kill the best men in Gotham. And the best man in Gotham... You see, let me back up. The Stag is an interesting character because the Shadow punishes and kills the worst of humanity, whereas the Stag kills the best of humanity. And if he can kill a certain number of people, then he can get into Shambhala, which is where the Shadow trained. And he's teamed up with the Joker, which the Joker this shows that this comic, even though it's in the DC universe, it doesn't feel like the Rebirth universe because the Joker's in here, and it's almost like a Jared Leto Joker if it was done right. Because he's wearing like a tuxedo t-shirt, like skinny jeans, and he has this shaved haircut. It's kind of weird. But like I said, it's like Jared Leto Joker if they did it right. You know what I mean? So that was pretty interesting. And there also you have Renee Montoya in here, as well as Crispin Freeman, who is not the Spectre. Which I'm like, did that happen in Rebirth? Did they bring back Renee Montoya and Crispin Freeman in here back? Because they're in here, and so is Harvey. They're all here. So it just to me, it just feels like it's its own DC continuity. Even though they have clear stuff from the Snyder run, it still feels like if you know what Batman is, then you can still read this comic. It's the same thing with the Shadow. If you don't know a lot about the Shadow, then that's totally fine. They'll explain it to you. This whole thing is to prop up the Shadow, really. But it never feels like more of a Shadow story, or does it feel like more of a Batman story? If anything, this is the one thing I always look for in these intercompany crossovers. The one thing I'm always looking for is balance between the characters, never overshadowing one franchise for another. And that's whenever Batman shows up, I'm always afraid Batman's going to take over everything. Like how, in Batman TMNT, it felt more like a Batman story with the Ninja Turtles showing up. Hopefully, I haven't read the sequel yet, but hopefully it's not like that. Anyway, so I'm really glad that in here, Batman and the Shadow get, equal ground. They get equal footing in this story. The artwork by Riley Russo, I believe that's the name, is awesome. It's very stylized, especially in the facial expressions when it comes to the Shadow. Speaking of that, there's also some great paneling where Batman gets captured and all these villains are together, and they're about to kill Batman, and Joker's just laughing, and then he stops laughing, but the laughter keeps continuing. He's like, "Wait a minute, that's not me." and Shadow just comes in like, "No, it was." It was like, "No." I can't remember what he said, but it was like really cool. But yeah, I really enjoyed that. So yeah, this is the cool story. This is a really cool story. It's nice to see Shambhala, where they're not like, it's not a promised land, it's more of a trap. And, even though it's not really like Kunlun, really. A lot of people compared Shambhala to Kunlun. It's not, because only evil men with evil hearts can come in, and there's two ways out of it: death or redemption. And they really play with the Stag, and he's an interesting villain because, yeah, it's the descendant of Cain, the first murderer. And it's actually how they play that up with the mythos of Cain and Abel is actually pretty fucking cool. So, yeah, this comic, I could go on and on about this. This is just such a great story. If if you aren't really big on the Shadow, that's totally fine. They'll explain it to you. But not like, oh, here's the Shadow, we're doing a whole information dump. It gives you enough to understand what the character is all about. So it just kind of, if you just know the character is just the pulp character with the 2 guns, that's totally fine. But it just gives you a little more. So yeah, I really enjoyed this comic. I thought this was a fantastic crossover. I was looking forward to it from day one, and I'm so glad it did not disappoint. Like I said, this might be one of my favorite crossovers ever. Yeah, just ever. I mean, still my number one is the first Batman vs. Predator comic, but this maybe might be in my top 10 favorite crossovers. I'm never going to do a list like that because it would be a long fucking list. Anyway, so you guys tell me in the comments below, if you've read Batman the Shadow, what did you think of it? Did you guys like it? Did you guys hate it? Just comment below, let me know, and once again, hope you all enjoyed this, and I will see you guys later.